So welcome to this video where I'm going to go through the set questions on this topic to give you some guidance about how you should develop your ideas, about how to approach the set questions and to develop your essay plans, which are due in very shortly. So just to remind you, the course is assessed by essay and examination. There's also a formative assessment, the essay plan, that's due Thursday the 5th of November, which is the end of week 5 of teaching. The essay itself, 2,500 words, half of your overall mark for this course. That's in Thursday the 26th of November, which is the end of week 8 of teaching. I've already talked about general issues around assessment in another video, which is in the assessment folder. Today I'm going to focus on the set questions. So just to say, the essay plan, it's really to start you engaging with the topic and to give you feedback, formative feedback on your ideas. Just to reiterate, the essay plan is not graded, but there is a 5-point penalty for non-submission. We don't care too much about how much detail you put into it. Shouldn't be more than 600 words. You should indicate what you're going to argue and what literature you're going to use to argue with it. But don't lose 5 points simply because you couldn't put in, it's 3 bullet points for the essay plan. And as I say, you don't need to write, detailed arguments. Bullet points of what you're going to argue are fine. So I've discussed this before, so I'm not going to go over it. But when we go through each essay question, we're going to be looking about how you can answer the question, how you can decode the essay title, how you can take the question on, define terms and so on, how you should be making an argument, and what kind of position you want to take in response to the set question. And those are the sorts of issues I'm going to focus on in response to the specific question titles. So normally I would have this at the end of this video, but it might be that you're going to fast forward just to the topic that you want to answer, and you won't be too concerned about what I have to say about the other questions. Other people might go through all of them, but I know some people will be much more selective. So I'm going to do the FAQs, frequently asked questions, first. Normally this would come at the end, but people might miss that if they're kind of just zooming in on the question that they're most interested in. So there's sometimes overlap between sessions on this course. Can you use material from another topic in the first half of the course to answer your set question? And yes, you can. There's nothing against that, but you don't need to. If you just use the materials from a single topic session, that would be fine. You get a very good answer just from the materials from a single week. But if you want to bring stuff across, you can. Just make certain you don't spread yourself too thin. So there are various elements to each session, and the material ranges across a number of different themes in each topic. Do you need to cover all of that in your essay? And my advice is no. Adopt a more selective focus. You've only got 2,500 words, so it's fine to sort of say, well, I'm only going to focus on racial inequality, for example, but you should acknowledge and justify your focus. How many readings should I use? Well, 8 to 10 are typical. You can use more. If you're using less, well, make certain that you are demonstrating knowledge of the literature, but also have a good focus on specific arguments and evidence so that you're not boiling stuff down too much, and there's a bit of nuance in how you're arguing things. Can you be plus or minus 10% over the 2,500 words? Yes, that's allowed. I don't recommend being under, but you can be a bit over if you want. We tend to use the Harvard system for referencing in sociology, but it's fine to use others. Just use one system accurately and consistently. Does my bibliography count towards my 2,500 word length? No. If you still have questions after watching the video, again, this is another slide I would normally put at the end, but I want everyone to see it, so I'm putting it near the front. If you still have questions that you want to raise with me, post them on Piazza in the folder for the essays, or raise them in class your tutorial, or you can email me. Very happy to receive emails. So just to remind you, the essay questions relate to the first 5 weeks of the course. There's a question for each of these topics, and this just kind of summarises the main issues that were covered in the lectures. You can also draw on the materials for class and tutorial, and in some cases we specifically focused on issues raised by the essay in class and tutorial. So these are the questions, as I say, one for each topic on the course. For topic 3, you have a choice of 2 essay questions. One is a bit more specific to the current circumstances of COVID-19, as a particular example of social and economic crisis and how that might change people's attitudes. The other is a bit more general in relationship to arguments about a middling social position. I'm going to go through these, so I won't say much more than that now. So first topic was, should people care about inequality? And the assessed essay asks you to assess the different principles of justice or fairness that have been used to justify inequality. And then there's a second part, to what extent does the scale of inequality affect these justifications? So let's break that down a little bit. I would say that the arguments and counter-arguments are the main part of that topic in the lecture segments anyway, that would help you with the essay. But you might also be interested in the meaning of subjective inequality and also the broader understanding of inequality itself, given that the class and the tutorial largely looked at economic justifications, or justifications rather of economic inequality. So, principles of justice or fairness that have been used to justify inequality. The key reading looked at that directly for that session. But what do we mean by inequality here? Income or wealth, which a lot of the readings do focus on, or are also interested in unequal rights, dignity, unequal distributions of power. As well, and certainly the Marshall et al. Reading was interested in distributions of power as a consequence of class relations. But also you might want to say, well, what about racial or gender inequality? So adopt a focus, but make that focus explicit, and you might also want to consider whether we might have criticisms of the literature that we've looked at for its narrow focus, for only looking at income or wealth inequality or class relations. What do you think about this? Do you think the scale of inequality affects justifications? And to do that, I think you really do need to think about evidence of the negative impacts of societies with high inequality, and how that variously affects justifications based on desert, entitlement, equality of opportunity, and functional efficiency. And really, to get into this question, you have to say to yourself, well, why would very high inequality affect the justifications more than a lower level? What's different about very high inequality? And it's really up to you to decide whether you think that the scale does matter, or whether some of these justifications might be absolute ones, whether they take priority over any of the issues around the level of inequality, because we're looking at more basic principles of liberty, freedom, and so on. And then finally, are the justifications also affected by the type of inequality? You're not asked about that, but you might want to consider whether that's an issue, and whether focusing just on the scale of inequality is insufficient, perhaps. So you might want to address that. Don't spread yourself too thin, though. You can touch on these issues, but make certain that you get into the crux of the arguments around the justifications. Don't forget to use the reading guide. The key readings on these topics have always been chosen with an eye to being helping you to answer the set question. So it would be surprising to me if you didn't at least draw in to some extent on the key readings. Thurborn is broadening the understanding of inequality. Marshall et al. Very much on point, but Byrne also offers another point of view, which is really about class relations as relations of exploitation. So bringing another set of arguments into the mix. But you also have readings on justifications of inequality extending beyond Marshall, patterns of inequality, the effects of high inequality on growth and opportunity, political accountability, on the psychosocial and epidemiological effects, as well as some kind of arguments around the dangers of too narrow a focus, particularly methodological nationalism. And all of those might be useful depending on which tack you take in your essay. So the second topic, attitudes and perceptions of inequality. The assessed essay for this is what shapes misperceptions of inequality and how significant are such misperceptions. And remember that one of the learning names here is to critically evaluate different theoretical accounts of misperceptions. So that's kind of what you're being asked to do in the assessed essay. So if we look at the learning blocks on this topic, in the tutorial we directly discussed whether misperceptions are important or not, and we considered a variety of arguments in the tutorial, and you can use the preparation activities to help with setting up your essay. We looked at firstly the nature of attitudes to inequality. We had quite a lot of material on misperceptions of inequality, restricted comparisons, the role of public discourses, as well as some counter arguments which queried the ignorance thesis. So one of the first things you need to address is to take on terms and define terms. How are perceptions of inequality said to be misperceptions? Midges, one of the key readings, focus on two kinds of misperception. Others, I think, range a little bit more broadly than that. So I think you might want to sort of say how you're focusing on that. You might want to narrow a focus, perhaps Midge's focus, but it's fine to acknowledge the broader look that other people are taking. And if you want to take a broader focus, that's fine too. Again, what kinds of inequality are these debates focused on? What do we mean by inequality in this context, in these debates? They're largely about income and wealth. Then also, if we're thinking about significance, why are they seen to be significant? What are the consequences seen to be of widespread misperceptions of inequality? So in a sense, you need to say why analysts think they matter. And you're also asked to think about what shapes misperceptions of inequality. So you need to consider the mechanisms which are claimed to underlie different kinds of misperception. How are they generated? And to assess the significance of those, you must consider and weigh up the opposing arguments and evidence, and really give me a sense of what you think on this topic. Again, use the reading guide for this. We have two key readings for the lecture and workshop which were directly about misperceptions, but we also had the work of McCall, who offers another point of view on that and suggests that misperceptions are perhaps both less than some analysts argue, but also perhaps not at all significant for a variety of reasons. She looks at other factors. There are readings in that topic on attitudes on public discourses and pejorative views of the poor and welfare recipients, which is another kind of misperception according to the arguments of those authors. But there's also work on the role of elite versus public attitudes. So one of the things we might want to say is, well, whose misperceptions, whose attitudes matter in these debates? So topic 3, how do people form a sense of inequality? And that's very much focused on reference group processes and social comparison, but also how they play a part in times of economic crisis, when people's sense of their social situation might be very fluid and subject to swift change. So there are two assessed essays on this topic. One is about the tendency for people to place themselves in the middle of the social hierarchy, and you're asked to assess whether that's a result of structural non-ideological reference group processes or whether more ideological factors are at work. And the second question is about how COVID-19 might change people's attitudes to inequality, and you have to answer with reference to reference group theory, although you can bring in other theories as well. You just must make certain that you cover reference group theory. So in that topic, the learning blocks did look at the role of reference groups and restricted viewpoints, but we also considered the role of ideology and if you like, sort of hegemonic understandings of inequality as well. And we also considered how people differently situated within social structures, the rich, for example, might view inequality rather differently from people at other points in the social hierarchy. But we also considered the role of social comparisons in shaping people's sense of economic crisis and whether that exacerbated people's sense of inequality or didn't in given historical examples. The tutorial looked explicitly at how will COVID-19 affect our sense of inequality, but there's broader work on the role of kind of middling social position and why people might have a sense of that as well in this topic. So let's take the first question on the topic. Why do people at all social levels tend to see themselves as having a middling social position? And what is that? What is that? How do we explain that? Is it reference group processes or more ideological factors? So firstly, I think you need to assess the evidence on people who give themselves a middling social position. How does that connect to arguments that there's a poor relationship between objective inequality and subjective inequality, a theme that runs throughout that topic, but also what is the evidence? On what basis is it claimed that people do place themselves in the middle of social hierarchies? And there's both quantitative and qualitative research on that. And then how do explanations which focus on structural reference group processes seek to explain that pattern? And why in particular are they seen as non-ideological? What's going on with that argument? What does ideology mean in that context? And then the other part of the kind of the explanatory puzzle that you're being asked to assess in this question, how do explanations which focus on ideological factors seek to explain the pattern, and what role do they place on questions of moral justification and blame, and perhaps also consider the role of the media in this process. And you're only being asked to say, you know, which set of explanations do you find most persuasive. If they're contradictory, and you need, I think, to decide whether you think they are contradictory or not, which one are you going to go for, or can they be combined? What do you think? And it might be that you're not particularly persuaded by the arguments or evidence at all on this topic. But again, you need to think about how you might make that argument if you want to be more contrary than the explicit setup in the set question. And then how might COVID-19 change people's attitudes? Answer with reference to reference group theory. So I should say at the outset, you do not have to be an expert in what is going on with COVID-19 or how it is affecting objective inequality. You might want to give a few examples of what is currently happening, but really you're being asked to speculate. You're being asked to consider what kinds of changing conditions might affect attitudes to inequality. So what could happen with COVID-19? So you don't need to read a great deal about what is happening around COVID-19. Instead, you might want to look at how reference group theory has been used to explain people's reactions to previous socioeconomic crisis and to consider what factors that they highlight. And particularly, they do look at reference group theory, the readings that we've looked at on this topic, and they emphasise particular kinds of social comparison that people can engage in. So what kinds of social comparison do you think that COVID-19 might provoke in people, and how might that affect people's sense of inequality, anger, and grievance? You should also think about whether there are alternative explanations to reference group theory that might also be useful for considering how COVID-19 might change attitudes. And in this topic, we looked at the role of ideology and the role of the media, social media and the press, for example, as well as political discourses. So you might want to consider whether those might also be helpful explaining how attitudes might be affected during COVID-19. And then finally, do you think, what's your opinion? Do you think COVID-19 will change attitudes? And if so, how and why? And if not, how and why? One of the things to say is that kind of the kind of the past economic crisis that we've looked at in the literature suggests that people's reactions are often quite limited, but that might not be the case for COVID-19, and we might want to consider whether what's happening with COVID-19 goes beyond the kind of economic austerity and recession that followed the 2008-9 economic crisis. Are we in a rather different situation? So it's worth thinking about that as well. The past does not necessarily act as the pattern for the future, remember, particularly because the future might be rather different. And don't forget to use the reading guide. The two key readings are very much about how people understand questions of inequality and how that is shaped by economic crisis, using to some extent reference group theory, although Owen moves beyond that. Ragnarsdottir et al. Also consider the role of the media and public discourses as well in their account. But there's also another point of view, Littler, who looks at the role of ideology, the ideology of meritocracy as a kind of legitimation of inequality. And there are also readings in the kind of further reading on this topic on restrictive viewpoints, relative deprivation and practical knowledge, populism and selective comparison as the basis of grievance, as well as elite anxiety and justifications for privilege. For topic 4, do people consent to inequality? The assessed essay is how well do theories of symbolic legitimation explain acquiescence to inequality? Now, we haven't yet reached this topic. Topics 4 and 5 are still to come, but because the essay plan comes in quite tight in week 5, I wanted to go over the essay questions for these topics, even though you haven't yet sort of gone into detail into the material, though you might have looked ahead a little bit. And I would recommend, if you're thinking about answering the questions on topic 4 and 5, do dip your toe into the materials now, so to help you with your essay plan. So in that topic, we look at different versions of theories of symbolic legitimation. The two main ones are Bourdieu's theory of doxa and the habitus, and Gramsci's theories about hegemony and common sense. Although we also look a little bit in the first lecture block at the Frankfurt School, although quite briefly. But there's also arguments and counter-arguments section where we consider firstly the limits to symbolic legitimation that theorists themselves set up, as well as criticisms, and one kind of very prominent critic, James C. Scott, who sets up some alternative explanations, and we'll consider those issues in class and tutorial when we consider Bourdieu's account of the doxa and the taken for granted, and then more generally we'll consider in relationship to the key readings why we think people put up with inequality and which set of arguments we find more persuasive. So, how well do theories of symbolic legitimation explain acquiescence to inequality? The first thing to say is acquiescence is in scare quotes. So you need to define acquiescence. What is the problem that it needs to be explained by theories? And because it's in quotation marks, that indicates it's potentially contested concept. So people may have a different understanding of what it is that needs to be explained in these debates. And broadly, it's a debate about whether acquiescence is true consent or much more grudging and coerced compliance. And then we see varying points of view on that. What are theories of symbolic legitimation, and which ones are you going to focus on? I would recommend focusing on one whilst nodding your head at others. Don't spread yourself too thin, or you might want to compare different versions as well, but just be conscious that you don't want to oversimplify arguments because you don't have enough space. So make certain that you have enough space to set out arguments with sufficient nuance and depth. How well in an essay title always indicates that you're being asked to look at limits or problems that have been identified with these theories. What are these limits or problems? And the theorists themselves, people who advocate theories of symbolic legitimation, themselves indicate limits, but there are also external, if you like, criticisms, the limits that have been much more forcefully identified by others who say that actually symbolic legitimation is by no means as extensive as some some people seem to suggest. And you're really being asked to weigh up those arguments. And of course, if we're saying, well, it's not symbolic legitimation which explains people's acquiescence, however we understand that, well, what does then? So we also need to consider the counter arguments, the alternative explanations. For this topic, you're only being asked to assess the arguments of Scott. How persuasive do you find those arguments? Do you still think we need a bit of symbolic legitimation in the mix to explain what's going on? And if so, what kind of balance are you going for? Again, use the reading guide to help you focus in on specific arguments for this essay. The key readings were Bourdieu, who, in argument with Terry Eagleton, who himself makes some criticisms for Bourdieu's stance, but as well as James Scott. Really focus on pages 70 to 90 for that piece. Because these are theoretical readings, they're slightly more difficult than some of the more empirical readings that we've looked at earlier in the course. So there are some overviews that secondary accounts that you can draw on, but you should be drawing on the primary accounts. Another point of view is really people advocating Gramsci's concept of hegemony and common sense, and particularly Crayon argues that Gramsci's concept of common sense is better than Bourdieu's alternative account using Doxa and the habitus. There are theoretical accounts of symbolic legitimation, hegemony and doxa, which include which not only explain those terms, although hopefully the lecture will do that sufficiently to get you into the topic. They go a little bit further, but you'll also see the critical accounts in those. And as I say, there are overviews and good secondary accounts. Please draw on those if you find the readings a little bit more difficult because they are more theoretical. And then the final topic, internalising inequality. The question here is how are accounts of the internalisation of inequality qualified by analysts, and what limits are there to the internalisation of inequality? So in this topic, we look at a number of different approaches to the idea that inequality is internalised, and there's some variation within that. We also look at internalisation in relationship to race, gender, as well as class. And we look at kind of how people negotiate the stigma of disadvantage, with that disadvantage variously understood, and we focus on that a lot in class and tutorial. But we also consider the limits to the internalisation of inequality in the third lecture block on that topic. So let's break down the set question. How are accounts qualified by analysts, and what limits the internalisation of inequality? So, as previously said, this topic looks at the internalisation of class, race and gender inequality. So please don't spread yourself too thin. You shouldn't really be covering all of those in the same detail. It's fine if you want to range across the three, but I think it's best if you focus on one and then sort of ring the changes with the other two. So what are you going to focus on and why? You need to set out why you want to narrow it down to one or the other of these. But also, when defining internalisation, bear in mind the variability in the concept in how it's deployed by different analysts. And we see arguments around internalisation ranging from notions of resignation and adjustment to limits, defensive othering, assimilation attempts, self-hatred and shame, to kind of the full if you like, ideological incorporation, loving the inevitable, where people really do swallow their own inferiority, if you like, in these accounts. And that variability really sets out different degrees of ideological incorporation, as well as resistance to and critical awareness of inequality. So if there are limits to what exactly? You might want to try and pin that down a little bit. And how are processes which produce some kind of internalisation also linked to there being limits to internalisation? So particularly when we look at arguments of stigmatisation, people say, well, people do internalise inequality, but that also sets up various kinds of limits as well. So people's negotiation of stigmatisation is quite complex, so the analysts themselves who are arguing that people do internalise inequality often often set up limits and kind of counter trends as well in their accounts. So when assessing limits to the internalisation, you need to consider the limits that proponents of the concept adopt, but also the more critical stances, people who say, well, actually, these arguments are problematic at their base, they go too far, and so on. More broadly, why does internalise matter? What are the implications of there being limits to inequality? Limits to internalisation. If, for example, internalisation matters for the reproduction of inequality, well, if there are limits to it, there are perhaps limits to the reproduction, the stable reproduction of inequality without dissent or protest, for example. And then finally, what do you think? Do you think that subordinate groups do internalise inequality? I'm interested in what you think and how you make an argument in relationship to this. And again, same point I've made all the way through. Use the reading guide. The key lecture and workshop readings are really helpful for thinking about inequality as a process of internalisation. Ruth Patrick offers another point of view where she says people do internalise, but it also sets up processes of resistance, the kind of because of people have to negotiate stigma associated with disadvantage. And there's further reading on theories of symbolic violence and hegemony, a little bit of overlap with the previous topic. We consider theoretical and empirical applications in relationship to race, gender and class. And there's also a section on critiques and qualifications, which should be useful to you. So I'm going to stop there. Good luck. Good luck with the essay plan. It's really a chance to get your ideas down in a kind of risk-free environment. You'll get feedback without any kind of penalties to that. But if you still have questions, do get in touch.